Hello everyone, my name is Tariq AlMusawi and I would like to present to you this quick presentation describing the current antimicrobial management for COVID-19. This presentation as of May 16, 2020. The management of COVID-19 in ICU patients entitled several broad lines of principles of treatment. There is the treatment for the viral pneumonitis. There is that for cytokine storm, for the multi-organ failure, management of thrombosis associated with COVID-19, secondary infections that may ensue after the ICU stay for COVID-19 patients, and maybe other ICU-related complications. Within the scope of this lecture, I will be emphasizing specifically on the top two, which are highlighted in green, which are viral pneumonitis and cytokine storm that associates with this viral disease. This is a summary of treatment trials and cohorts to date. As you could see on the left, there are the different antivirals, and on the right are the immunomodulators. Again, the scope of these lectures will ensue those who are projected to you on the green color. So we start with the first. Hydroxychloroquine with or without azithromycin has gained a lot of publicity, and it has been used by a wide range of practitioners. This happened from this small study, which started from France, in a randomized study. As you could see, it looked at patients who are received hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin and possibly suggest clearance of the virus in a fast way. As you could see, there is a limited number of patients and there are massive limitations to the study, and interpreting anything of this graph may be difficult. But nevertheless, like I have alluded to, this was a spark to a lot of subsequent studying and administration of hydroxychloroquine with or without azithromycin to patients with COVID-19, as it is already known that hydroxychloroquine in vitro may clear some of other viruses other than coronavirus. So following that, there had been so many trials or immediate administration, even away from trials, looking or trying to look at the effect of chloroquine/hydroxychloroquine and COVID-19 patients. This is a table that summarized to you with references how many that has been carried out, and unfortunately the vast majority showed no significance or no difference between giving hydroxychloroquine or giving placebo, or basically giving nothing, and maybe at some there may hold some risk related to cardiac arrhythmia associated with the use of hydroxychloroquine. Of note is those recent evidences which were published earlier in May 2020, and on the left side you see a combination of hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin being given to 1,438 hospitalized patients, and there was no reduced in-hospital mortality. As a matter of fact, there was an increased risk of cardiac arrest, and the design was then that they had different numbers of patients. Some were given hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, some only hydroxychloroquine, some received only azithromycin alone, and the last received neither. And then we could see there is no difference that has been associated with hospital mortality for any of these arms. On the right side, you see the effect of hydroxychloroquine, and among 1,446 hospitalized COVID patients, it showed no reduced risk of being intubated or dying, and that's how the study was designed, for looking at the effect of prevention of intubation or prevention of death, and it did not show the effect needed. So with that, until this moment, we do not feel that hydroxychloroquine or combined with azithromycin or hydroxychloroquine alone would show a significant difference in the way it would make patients recover faster or prevent death, or even prevent complication related to critical illness like prevention of intubation. The problem with the frequent usage of those two agents is of many reasons. One of them is desperation, when you don't have any other agent to treat this lethal disease. And the second is that it has gained a lot of publicity since March 2020, especially when top politicians in the world has been talking about the possible effect, beneficial effect of hydroxychloroquine. And also, since that time, hydroxychloroquine, with or without azithromycin, has been in a lot of local as well as national guidelines to so many countries. And there are, to my knowledge, many countries, as the time come by, are changing their protocols and removing this agent as a treatment option to COVID-19. Next is Lopinavir with ritonavir versus control. This is open label randomized controlled trial. Participants were on a median of 13 days after symptom onset, and the primary outcome was looking at a difference for clinical improvement, and the primary outcome here showed no difference, as you could see on the graph on the left, and there is a trend toward faster improvement in subgroup when started earlier before 12 days of symptoms. There were fewer days in the ICU, probably 6 versus 11, with those who received Lopinavir-ritonavir, also known in the market as Kaletra. And this implies that it is not useful late in the therapy, but it may require, but it needs to be studied earlier in the disease course and some other. This is the looking at the same diagram, looking that there is no difference for clinical improvement when it was looked into whether viral load would be reduced or there would be a significant reduction of viral load after giving Lopinavir-ritonavir. Again, it showed no difference. Table that shows secondary endpoints to this trial, which was roughly 100 in each arm. There is possibly some little gain with the ICU stay, like I have shown you earlier, and maybe randomization to hospital discharge was showed some difference here between 12 days to 4 days, which means somewhere have received it at a different time compared to the others, and maybe some little improvement in a subgroup, but the primary endpoint did not achieve the success which was pursued. Moreover, there are some trials still looking at Lopinavir-ritonavir, but after this trial, it lost a lot of confidence and popularity, and it has been gradually being removed from many protocols related to COVID-19 treatment, except within the context of randomized trials. Okay, the next agent is Remdesivir, and Remdesivir for the past 3 or 4 weeks have gained so much publicity, so many announcements has been taking place within the medical community and as well as the media and political community as well. So this is the famous Lancet trial, which described which looked into this primary outcome, which is time to clinical improvement in ordinal scale, or time to live discharge from the hospital. And the clinical improvement was looked into based on the table provided here, when there is an improvement in 2 steps from in this scale. So the worst thing in the scale is basically death. Subsequently, which is better than that, is hospital admission on ECMO or mechanical ventilation, or hospital admission on non-invasive ventilation or high-frequency nasal cannula, or next is hospital admission on oxygen nasal cannula, or hospital admission on no extra oxygen supplementation, and finally discharge. So any improvement in this scale by 2 steps is considered attaining the primary outcome. And the statistics and analysis were pre-specified recruitment goal. They were aiming for around 450 with possible interim analysis around 240. No patients were enrolled after March 12 because the outbreak was controlled in Wuhan, China. And then unfortunately, they did not attain the number that they have required, so they have studied whichever number they have gotten, which is close to 224. So what you see in these tables is that patients, and many of them actually were receiving other therapies, including lots of steroids, and other modalities, including alpha-2b at the baseline. And in the top of the table on the right side, you could see that if early treatment was provided, i.e. less than 10 days from symptom onset, there was some difference between the two. Remdesivir group 46% and 60% for the placebo group, when relation to time from symptom onset to starting therapy. And so it would make a difference if this given early compared to giving it late. But the overall outcome from this Lancet study is that there is no difference in the days to clinical improvement, putting everything together. And also there was no difference in reducing the viral load in the upper airway or the lower airway, as demonstrated by no difference in viral load reduction in the diagram provided over the days in comparison. So since no major difference in outcome, but there was a trend towards benefit when it started less than 10 days of onset. And here I've highlighted within this table that when it was given early, below 10 days of symptom onset, there was some difference, 11% of clinical improvement in the Remdesivir group compared to the placebo group. So it could bring about the alertness that if this trial were to be repeated and to be given earlier in the onset of disease, it may make some difference. So obviously Remdesivir has been studied in other situations and other scenarios. Here is a study looks at Remdesivir decreases the infectious virus titer from bronchoalveolar lavage samples and rhesus macus, but not in viral load. And what you could see on the chart A, that the viral load was relatively high throughout the days post intubation, but on the subsequent one, you see there is a significant reduction of the virus titer, which we think is an infectious virus, which means you may still have a viral load, but it may not describe an infectious virus. So there is a difference in Remdesivir capability in reducing the infectious virus, which is the virus that is contagious, that is capable of transmitting disease to others. So this is one benefit that has been proven through this animal study. And because of the Lancet trial and some other smaller studies, the NIH clinical trial shows Remdesivir accelerates recovery from advanced COVID-19 was released to the public in this press release with the preliminary results, and everybody remembers the officials in the United States addressing this major elements in the press release. They have enrolled almost 1,000 patients, a total of 68 sites, 47 in the United States and 21 in Europe and Asia. And Remdesivir was better than placebo. It had 31 faster time to recovery than placebo, 11 days versus 15 days with statistical significance. And there is a trend towards mortality benefit, which is 8% versus 11.6%, with a p-value of 0.059, something maybe addressing some light towards the end of the tunnel. Certainly this is not enough. We're still waiting for the peer review of this paper to come to publication, but it may bring about some hope, and it may also set further design to more studies in the future that may bring about some solution. So because of this study, the FDA Emergency Use Authorization, EUA, they have approved yes, they do approve the use for the Remdesivir for an emergency use for the treatment of hospitalized COVID-19 who are known to be sick. And on the same day, Gilead, which is the company producing Remdesivir, have their own press release with prelim results from severe cohort. And this is a group of patients that through a study that is Gilead sponsored or industry sponsored study that looked into COVID patients with severe disease but not requiring mechanical ventilation or ECMO. They have defined anybody with oxygen saturation less than 94 or equal or requiring any supplemental oxygen at screening. And what they have seen is in the first in the columns you see between 5 days and 10 days there was no difference in the recovery time between 5 days and 10 days, and that was still enough for the EUA and FDA to approve that for those who are not on mechanical ventilation and they are started in Remdesivir, they can be given over 5 days instead of 10. Now another agent is Favipiravir. Favipiravir is an RNA polymerase inhibitor. This was a small open-labeled, non-randomized clinical trial that came out of China that compared the Favipiravir with inhaled interferon alpha versus historical controls who received Kaletra or Lopinavir-ritonavir and inhaled interferon alpha. So the historical cohorts simply are not patients who are concurrently compared at the same time, but they are patients from the past that somehow match the same profile of clinical illness to those of COVID-19. So, and then they were here that have the number of patients who have received Favipiravir were 35 patients in the Favipiravir arm and 45 on the historical cohort receiving Kaletra. The median time to viral clearance was 4 days in the Favipiravir versus 9 days on those receiving who had received Kaletra with statistical significance. And then started before 7 days of symptoms was the time when Favipiravir was given, and it was thought to be that it was well tolerated. After this study, there has been some smaller studies looking for a better outcome for Favipiravir, and still that has not been achieved so well, and there are still some ongoing looking into this. Now I will switch gear and talk about agents that are immunomodulators, and they gain their logical benefit from understanding the proposed COVID-19 pathogenesis. If you look at this diagram, you see that the severity of illness in the y-axis compared to time course in the x-axis looked into COVID-19 disease as of 3 stages. There is the early stage when there is more of a viral response phase, and the subsequent stage 2, which is pulmonary disease, when there is start to have some host inflammatory response phase. And then all the way to stage 3, when there is a hyperinflammation phase, which is mainly host response phase, and then maybe the viruses are just bystanders, a phenomena that we've always known about severity of inflammatory response to a lot of microorganisms, even a feature known about ARDS, regardless of the type of microorganisms that is causing that disease. And here's an evidence from COVID-19 patients with the hyperinflammatory state. In the far left, you see that there is a segregation between those who have survived and the non-survivors, looking at D-dimer in particular. But if you look carefully into other elements between lactate dehydrogenase, serum ferritin, IL-6 specifically, there is a major discrepancy between those who survived, which are plotted in blue. They have lower levels of all these inflammatory markers compared to those who did not survive or died. They have, which are plotted in red, they have higher levels of all these inflammatory markers. And here is the same results, but in numbers. You could see between the survivors and non-survivors significant difference in the serum values of those two, specifically to IL-6 or interleukin-6, which is the target of some of these agents, and as we would see now. Okay, so IL-6 did not only show that it is higher than the people who have died, but it has always also been shown upon admission that the levels of IL-6 would predict the need for mechanical ventilation. Here you see in the chart A that those who required mechanical ventilation were having higher levels of IL-6, and then and those upon first assessment, and then even after just immediately before intubation, which might be days from their initial presentation, the IL-6 remained at high values, which in comparison to those who did not require mechanical ventilation. So it may predict mechanical ventilation, and this is another study here associated with RNA viremia, that which means the higher the viral load, the higher IL-6, and it also may suggest a higher severity of illness. This is another study that looked into not only IL-6 would be high at the time of having high viral load, but also prolonged viral RNA shedding, as you could see here. Those who would have patients who would have IL-6 median less than 6.75, they would probably stop shedding the virus around day 20, 22 or so, and those who will be having higher IL-6 of more than 6.75 would continue to shed the virus even beyond day 40 or 45. So what do we know about tocilizumab? Tocilizumab is an immunomodulator. It's an interleukin-6 blocking agent. In this non-randomized case series of 21 patients that came from China very early in the pandemic, their criteria for using tocilizumab was bilateral infiltrate plus severe or critical clinical criteria. And in the table below, it described what the criteria for severe disease and criteria for critical illness. Simply those who had been enrolled were having any one of those of severe criteria and any one of those in critical criteria. The severe criteria looked into hemodynamics, and the critical criteria looked into clinical conditions. And this is a description on the left of those who were enrolled, the 21 patients. So history of presentation, history of hypertension was present in almost 43%, history of diabetes in 24%, severe illness was present in 81%, and critical was in 19%. So one criteria of this is enough to be enrolled, and or a criteria of the other. And it shows reported an excellent safety, and reported 19 out of 21 patients were discharged. 2 remained hospitalized at the time of the study published. And note that the average time for hospitalization after tocilizumab dose was around 13.5 days. Interestingly, you could see carefully here in chart A, looking at C-reactive protein, the immediate reduction after starting the toci, and then also in chart B, looking at temperature decline, In chart C, the concentration of oxygen inhaled or the FiO2 supplementation required, and then the oxygen saturation proven by the days after tocilizumab was given. So this was a very promising study, and then several studies had followed, including this, which is considered the largest case series, 63 patients who received TUSI from Italy. The mortality was 11%. Other markers improving survival, but obviously this was just a case series, so there was no comparison group. But what you could see on the left, that day 0, day 7, and day 14, how serial improvement in PF ratio is evident. And if you look at the surrogate markers of inflammation on the right side, you could see the dimer coming down, CRP coming down, ferritin more controlled, and temperature resolution was evident. After that study, this is an interesting study, which is for kind of local. It comes from colleagues in Qatar, and they have given TUSI for severe COVID-19, a cohort of 25 patients. They had similar outcomes in the parameters looking at C-reactive protein and oral temperature reductions after giving the immunomodulator, and specifically here looking at mechanical ventilation, looking at other means of supplementing oxygen like non-invasive mechanical ventilation, oxygen, nasal oxygen, ambient air, and they have found there is a reduction from day 1 to day 17 by 60% of invasive mechanical ventilation with p-value of 0.03, and a reduction to 28% of invasive mechanical ventilation with significance from day 1 to day 14. So this is an interesting and maybe promising drug that need to be looked into further in the future, since we have fairly promising good results. Next is convalescent plasma. These are several small case series that had used the convalescent plasma. The first one from South Korea, which was given only over 2 patients, it has some favorable outcome. And the second was in China, 10 patients who had severe disease. There was a favorable response too, with reduction in C-reactive protein and reduction in viral load in 7 out of 10 patients. The third one, again in China, in 5 patients were critically ill. Again, favorable response with reduction in temperature, reduction in their SOFA score. 3 out of those 5 managed to be discharged. And the last from China again, where 6 patients were critical, had a favorable response with mixed pictures. The convalescent plasma is being tried in so many places all over the world. The concept behind it is giving concentrated serum from people who have recovered from COVID-19 to people who are undergoing the disease. The scientific idea of the plasma given to sick patients is to have neutralizing antibodies having an effect on the viruses to neutralize it and to defeat it, so the clinical symptoms would be controlled. The problem with convalescent plasma are many, one of which is that it's technically difficult to be carried out in the vast majority of places. Extracting the plasma is of cumbersome and labor intensive and maybe expensive too. And number 3, we still don't know how much to extract from patients, and then subsequently how much to be given as a dose to sick patients to make the clinical effect required. So there is one study here in China with 6 patients who had eventually 5 of the 6 who have died. So what do we know about current guidelines? there are so many guidelines, and every other day you come up with every society and every local authority would give different guidelines, maybe different in the way they are presented, but the content is almost the same. They are looking at the same exact medications that I have alluded to here and maybe some others. And what they all have concluded is that the treatment is only within randomized control or randomized clinical trials, which means none of which is approved to treat outside the context of randomized clinical trials. Now, we all know how difficult it is to undergo clinical trials. Number one, there are a lot of logistic issues. There is a different perception of people towards being subjects within clinical trials, and local and legal logistics related to that, as well as ethical and so on and so forth. But in the face of this storm of COVID-19 patients, a lot of people are basically prescribing some of these medications under the effect of desperation of wanting to do something good to many of the dying patients in the ICUs. So, so finally, to say that since this lecture is mainly addressed toward maybe a group of intensivists more than anybody else, since it's described a critical illness with COVID-19, here is a summary of what the Surviving Sepsis Campaign guidelines published in March 2020 looked into some of the evidences, and then you see far right is the strength of that. So the summary here, as far as the medication is concerned, they suggested for fever, they claim or they suggest using acetaminophen / paracetamol for temperature control over no treatment, and they do suggest against the routine use of standard IVIG, convalescent plasma, Lopinavir / ritonavir. So basically they are against it based on some of the data I have shown you, and there is insufficient evidence for them to issue a recommendation in using any of the following: either other antiviral agents, recombinant interferons alone or in combination with antivirals, chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine, or tocilizumab. Basically no recommendation. I think we were told by the authors of these guidelines over many webinars and publications is that they're going to be an update. We're anticipating an update because the literature is evolving with regard to treatments of COVID-19 patients, and the trials are ongoing. Many of which has been actually published since this last Surviving Sepsis Campaign guidelines. And finally, I would like to show you what is an ongoing on clinical trials for COVID-19 treatment. There are almost 16 ongoing trials for Lopinavir-ritonavir, still more to come with Remdesivir, some other anti-HIV agents, Remdesivir and Combistat are ongoing. Favipiravir, 4 trials ongoing. And interestingly, there are still people trying with 43 trials with chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. Steroids is always there. Whenever you think of any disease leading to inflammation, there must be people trying steroids. It's an agent we know since ages. So maybe methylprednisone will do some. And by the way, methylprednisone has been in the national protocol to some countries that I know of, which Italy, for example, have put methylprednisone as one of their frontline agents for COVID-19. Also, so maybe some more about immunomodulator agents and so on. So with that, I would like to conclude here. I thank you so much for your attention, Be safe, and we hope we would have more encounter with subsequent lecture and updates in the near future. Thank you.